never, ever, for both security and psychological reasons, save your credit card details to any online store. Just do not do it. Any kind of layer of friction that you can build into the system is good.
Welcome to What I Meant to Say. I'm your host, Wendy Jones, founder of Be Better Media and a mom of 4, passionate about human connection. Throughout my journey, I have experienced many What I Meant to Say moments. But since life doesn't give us do-overs, I've created a space to reflect and tell our stories again, with a little more grace for ourselves and the hope that we can help others and be better for having listened. Welcome to What I Meant to Say. I'm your host, Wendy Jones, and I'm here today with Merle van den Akker. I'm very, very excited to talk to somebody with Dutch blood. I'm a Dutchie too. My grandmother was full-blooded Dutch, and Merle's a behavioral scientist. She has her PhD in behavioral science and really applies that to the finance industry and how people make financial decisions. And I'm really, really excited to dig into this because I think it's a topic that really affects our lives so much. And the way that, families operate and the way that we can teach our kids to be better financial managers. And there's just so many things that I'm excited to dig into. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. Let's dig into it.
I mean, getting your PhD, that's no small feat. So what made you get into to behavioral science and what interested you there in the first place?
Oh, that goes back way further than my PhD. So I wanted to study psychology. I knew that from the get-go. As soon as I was at the end of high school, I knew that psychology is it for me. I find people absolutely fascinating. I find them surprisingly consistently inconsistent in their behavior, which I find it's just very interesting to me. Now, psychology is really quite broad, and I have a very limited attention span, and I don't switch between topics very easily. So I was like, I want to study psychology as applied to something very specific. And as fascinating as I find clinical and developmental psychology, that wasn't really my vibe. And ultimately, also through my dad being an economist, I settled on wanting to study economic psychology, which is sort of what I did. And then, economic psychology looks a lot like behavioral economics, which is a subset of behavioral science. So ultimately, from an undergraduate program into a master and then into a PhD, so I could further explore from a research angle specifically what makes people tick when it comes to money. So that's how I rolled into it. So it's just I knew from the ripe age of 17 what I wanted to study, and I just kind of kept at it.
That's amazing. And I know that, there's a lot of things with money and the way we make financial decisions where, there can be a lot of limiting beliefs. There can be a lot of stories we tell ourselves, with, what we deserve and how we go about getting it. What are some of the things that you've encountered through behavioral psychology that you could help people maybe form a better relationship with money and the way that they make their decision?
I think, and there's lots of great books on this. One of them is by a Vishal George called The Money Mindset. And Vishal is actually a Kiwi. He's currently based in New Zealand. He has a very relaxed attitude. But he often states that really people assume that as they start to engage with money, start to make their own financial decisions, that somehow they're starting at zero, that they have a really neutral viewpoint of money. You don't. That is not possible. Your viewpoint of money and your relationship to money is very often already shaped by your childhood, by your parents, and by whomever was in your direct social circle when you were growing up. And that can go as far as, how does your culture talk about money? Does your culture talk about money at all? Is your culture very conspicuous, which would be a very American-esque culture where wealth is there to be flaunted? Or are you much more, are you much more of a Western European type? Think of the Dutch and Germanic cultures, where it is actually very distasteful to flaunt wealth, and where most decisions around wealth are relatively risk averse. So it could be, as big as culture, being how do you relate to money? Is it there to spend? Is it there to save? Are we looking at the next 5 years? Are we looking into the future at all? And then, of course, your family situation. Was your family wealthy? And if they were wealthy, did they talk about that wealth? They talk about how that was made? Or is this very much something that, you kept to yourself? Your parents never discussed money with you. Or, were you on the poor end of the spectrum? Did you know if your family was poor? If so, why they were poor, how they got into that situation? And obviously, how do the larger socioeconomic systems contribute to that situation? Whether you were poor, middle class, incredibly wealthy, things like this. So yeah, there is no neutrality point. Like, you come into the world not knowing anything about money, but you grow up knowing a lot about it. And then when you have to make your own financial decisions, that is the, I'm afraid to say, psychological baggage you're gonna have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes so much sense to me. And that psychology really being there as we come into adulthood, and having that foundation laid. As a parent, I'm wondering, are there ways that you would recommend communicating in a household to, help the next generation really understand how to relate to money in a way that can help them be more successful?
It's a really great question. I have a friend of mine. She's now based in the States. Her name is Margaret Achelbarger. Yeah, that's it. I know it's a name. But Margaret actually studies this specifically. So she studies how parents talk to their kids and what seems to work on the much, much longer term. So this is longitudinal research. It's absolutely fascinating. So she'd be a very good person to talk to. But in general, generations ago, it was very common to teach household finance or personal finance in school. So late primary, early high school. At least it used to be where I'm from. My parents were taught this. My generation was not, which is very, very unfortunate, because it is very strange to have children, go through years and years and years of school, and now they do know how to do calculus, and they know how to do statistics, and they have a vague idea about geography. Geography was not my strong suit, but they have absolutely no idea how the tax system works in their respective countries. They do not know how to balance books. So I personally find that incredibly strange. I am also a massive proponent of personal finance education, just for transparency's sake. But I think realistically, for your children, you can emulate an economic environment where there are ways for kids to earn money, whether you want to do that through them getting good grades. I know not every parent is a massive fan of that, because it means you're outsourcing what it means to, perform well in school. And now you're throwing that into external motivation territory. Not a lot of people like that. It's completely understandable. But you can have them mow the lawn, you can have them help you clean the house, or in any way that kids can responsibly support the household, of course. You can give them money for that. Maybe they can start a small side business, which is still responsible for whatever age they are. Maybe they could mow the neighbor's lawn. There are ways about this. So now they have an income. And this is becoming very, monopoly simulator, but now they have an income. And then realistically, you can sit down with them and ask them, so what is it that you would like to do with this income? Is this something that you would like to save? Are we saving towards something? Is this something they immediately want to spend? It would be very interesting to see from the get-go what your child's perception is of money and what their immediate and future goals are. And if they have future goals, for example, there are trade-offs you can discuss. There are savings plans and, workout plans that you can help them make. You can maybe even help them budget. And then, it depends on how involved you want to be from the get-go and how supportive you want to be, or whether you want to have your child make their own mistakes and learn that way. Both are, of course, perfectly valid. And that's, that's how you can start doing that. But you can start doing that from a relatively young age, as soon as, the parent in the situation thinks they can go about their child earning a wage responsibly, of course.
Yeah. What are some of the things that both either as children or as adults, the way our personality plays into the decisions that we make financially? What do you see in the field of behavioral science that helps us make those decisions?
There is so much. So one of my favorite academics, so his name is Scott Rich. He also currently has a book out. He has a lot of work done around tightwads and spendthrifts. So these are personality types that spend and relate to money really quite differently. So a spendthrift, as the name kind of indicates, is someone who gets a lot of pleasure from spending money, like a lot of pleasure. So they don't really experience the pain of paying, which is just a nicely framed way of saying all the negative emotions associated that come with paying. So the loss of money, seeing the balance on your account go down or your credit card balance go up, or whichever way you do this. And then you've got people who are completely on the other end of the spectrum, so the tightwads. So people who have essentially the scrooges. So people who really do not enjoy spending money, and they don't really get a lot of pleasure from spending money, regardless of what it is that they're buying, even if what they're buying is something they've really, really, really wanted. So these are like two personality archetypes of how people relate to money. Now, how do you have a personality like that? That's again probably whatever happened in your previous life. We do see it a lot of people who come from a background where they could never splurge. So someone who is probably from a lower socioeconomic background, that once they do have money, they can turn into a massive spendthrift because, there's finally money and you better spend it because finally here is the moment and you can do it responsibly. Or they turn into a massive tightwad because they've known, poverty, for example, and they never want to spend the money again. It can go both ways, which makes, the psychology of it very, very interesting. But I'm afraid it doesn't necessarily answer your question. I think that the best way of testing whether someone is a spendthrift or a tightwad is to generally sit down with yourself and almost self-diagnose and be like, do any purchases or does any kind of spending money give me a lot of pleasure? Like, do I look forward to spending money? And if so, is that just all around spending money? Like, is this, do you even get excited about your energy bill? Because I know I personally do not. Or is it mainly, hedonic consumption? So is it shopping for clothing or new tech or, something for the children? Maybe holidays. Lots of people really get a kick out of being able to just in one swoop buy a whole holiday, which obviously is a very nice thing to do. So things like this, and then you can slowly start to figure out probably also where, if you are on a very tight budget or on any budget at all, where your pitfalls and where your temptations may be. Because if you're like me and your temptation is always shoes, this is probably not something that you should, these are not websites or these are not things that you should seek out after a long working day with a glass of wine behind the laptop alone, credit card next to you. It's probably not the vibe you should aim for.
Yeah. So knowing what your triggers are, right, before you sit down to. So is there somewhere down the middle that you suggest that people shoot for? Like if they are training their habits, I mean, you don't want to be a spendthrift or a tightwad. How do you kind of train that place down the middle where maybe you are successful and you're also saving, but you're having some of the experiences that you want? How can people do that?
It's a really interesting one because I don't think most people fall within the extreme. So this is very much like a distribution where most people do sit in the middle. So there'll be a spendthrift in some areas, and there'll be a tightwad about some areas, and they just kind of fall in the middle. And it's also really not that hardcore. Like I think most of the time when people think of a tightwad, they generally do picture Scrooge, where like money is held under a mattress or like cash is stacked away in a vault, never to be heard of or seen again. That's not how most people function. That's incredibly rare. And the most aggressive spendthrift would be someone with shopping addiction, for example, or someone in a manic or hypomanic state, which is clinical already. So this doesn't exist much within regular people, if you will. But if you're somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, as I said, most people will be, then it is, as you said, it's really about identifying your triggers. If you are a tightwad, which I have to say, you're more likely to be a spendthrift because obviously you're spending money on things you like, obviously, you're going to get a bit of a kick out of that. So most people do sit on a bit more to the spendthrift side. But realistically, if you are on a budget and you know what your triggers are, it's probably best to avoid your triggers. So in the same way that cocaine addicts probably shouldn't be too close to mirrors and other reflective flat surfaces or whatever a situation they normally use to do drugs in, it's probably also best that if you are a bit of a shopaholic, that you should not continue finding yourself in the situations that you know that you spend a lot of money in. So realistically, probably block the websites that you used to shop on. Never, ever, for both security and psychological reasons, save your credit card details to any online store. Just do not do it. Any kind of layer of friction that you can build into the system is good, because I I find it really funny. I really enjoyed the movie Confessions of a Shopaholic, but the issue with that is that she freezes her credit cards. But nowadays, if your credit card details are saved in the system, it doesn't matter where the physical card is. Your laptop knows. Like, you don't have to freeze anything. This thing still works. So,
Interesting point. I loved that book. I remember it now. It's been years since I read it, and then that's right, they made a movie out of it. But yeah, I mean, in modern times, things are saved. There are apps that make it faster to pay. Yes. So really they're faster at the behavioral science of buying things than the average consumer is. So they're trying to beat us to the punch, right? And then
they're managing.
Can you talk a little bit about that intersection between marketing and the consumer and how behavioral science plays into that?
So I know exactly what you're after, because I said that behavioral science very often is the opposite of marketing. And that's not to say that there's something wrong with marketing and that marketing is is a field filled with terrible people who just want to get your money. But a lot of marketing is about selling a product or a service. That is what marketing does. That is why they exist. Now, obviously, they can sell a lot of products and services which are for the greater good. Health insurance is a very good example of that. It's probably a good idea to have health insurance, says the person from a Western European background. But yeah, I mean, it makes a difference. I know it does. But there are products, fast fashion, for example, or vapes. Like I have a personal vendetta with vapes, to full transparency. But like, marketing is trying to sell you those. Well, if you're on a very strong budget and you really can't afford to be spending money on fast fashion, and if you're on a really stringent budget, like you just can't afford to really buy clothes in general, like getting spammed consistently with emails or personalized ads on your social media, or you leave the house and there's billboards and ad campaigns and bus stops and whatever all around you. We talk about identifying your triggers, but if you have like a really strong desire to shop, if that is your weakness when it comes to managing money, you have not created, and you're not able really to create, a friendly environment for your own weakness. Your environment is actually relatively hostile to the weakness that you yourself have identified. And that is really quite a problem. Now, there are behavioral, scientific, and psychological techniques to make sure that you don't react to this as much as you might normally do. But realistically, this is from this perspective, the marketing in that regard can sometimes be very much anti-consumer, whereas behavioral science tries to be helping the consumer, like nudge them into the direction that they themselves want to go. As I said, that's not to say all marketing is bad, and that's not to say that all behavioral scientists are angels, because there's plenty of behavioral scientists in sectors that still try to trick the customer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think as a behavioral scientist, you have more knowledge as to what's going on in the brain that makes us feel a certain way, right? When we buy something, or we choose not to buy something, or we can, I talk to my kids about, I know for me, I value, at this point in my life, I value experiences more than stuff, right? So I'll talk to my kids like on a holiday and say, I'd rather, go to a show, like let's get these Broadway tickets rather than buy you something else that's going to sit on the shelf, and know that experience is something that we'll all value together. So I like the way personally I've looked at my own life and making those decisions, but I think understanding the brain chemistry behind why we do what we do. Can you help people kind of understand what's going on in their brain when they think they want something, and then whether they decide to buy it or not buy it?
So specifically in the process of wanting to buy something, what you're looking at is a lot of anticipations, not these words, about the thing that you're about to buy. So these anticipation is a really interesting one, because you actually already have a lot of pleasure being triggered, so a lot of dopamine release in your brain when you're looking forward to something. And actually, this is what most people seem to get wrong. You don't release dopamine, so like the pleasure neurotransmitter, if you will, when you have the thing. You actually release most dopamine when you think of having the thing just before you have it. Like you actually predict how much pleasure a thing is going to give you. That's what your brain does. And then you get the thing, and then you release either no dopamine, even more dopamine, or actually you have a dip in your dopamine. And the reason these three are different is because you now have to compare the reality of the experience to what you thought it would be. So it's very much the is reality meeting the expectation. And if your reality is even better, you release even more dopamine. This was the best experience ever. You're having a blast. This is just the greatest. So I hope your Broadway shows are very much like this. When
Yeah,
you go
right.
excellent, love to see it, love to hear it. When you don't produce any dopamine anymore, when you get the thing that you're buying, that just means that your prediction was actually really, really quite accurate. So you see this a lot with things that we buy very regularly, things that we have a habit of buying. Not really like a lot happens. You also see this quite often with more utilitarian things, where we don't expect a lot of pleasure from buying a couch. And then when we buy the couch, we now have the couch is here, everyone's happy. But there's not a lot of dopamine release associated with this kind of a purchase. Now, the worst kind is where you were really looking forward to something, lots of dopamine was produced, but then the reality happens and it doesn't meet expectation. And then you actually have a dip in dopamine where now you fall below what your regular baseline is. And this is how a lot of people experience disappointment. So it wasn't as great as they had hoped. So this is one of the things that's happening in the brain. But of course, when it is just before a purchase, obviously there was a lot of dopamine production. You are keen, you're happy, you're excited. But in that kind of state, logic kind of goes out the window. So this is very much system one, very fast, very biased kind of thinking, where it's just like, oh, I'm so excited, I'm getting the thing, I want the thing, I'm having the thing. We're only really thinking about the here and now. And we're all very excited. It's a beautiful day. As I said, logic kind of goes out the window. The longer term view kind of goes out the window. So this is how people can very easily get tempted into buying things, because in the moment it's a great experience. And when I say that you were looking forward to buying the thing, this is not like a week-long, month-long process. This can very much be like you're in the store, you see something you like, and you're like, oh, I would love to have that. The dopamine gets produced then, before you actually have it. Like this can be, a time span of seconds or minutes, and your brain is just telling you like, oh, this is the thing that's giving me pleasure, let's have it. And then of course you go to the till. Now for tightwads, this is unfortunately the most painful part of the exchange. Spendthrifts, they rely much more on pleasure. So for them, pleasure matters much more than the pain of paying. And so tightwads now have a very a rough patch to go through, where they experience all the negative emotions associated with paying for something. So they must really, really, really want this type of product, because otherwise they wouldn't fork out the money. Whereas with spendthrifts, they're now like, yeah, I'll pay for it. Just give me the thing, give me the thing, give me the thing. So often spendthrifts also tend to be a bit more impulsive kind of people, but they don't really need to be.
Yeah. So are there health effects, and are there stresses that come with either one of those that people should consider?
I think health effects, like you said, like extreme hoarding or like being in extreme debt and just dealing with the stress of that. Again, you only really see that on the extreme ends of the spectrum. And keep in mind, someone who is incredibly wealthy and has like an incredible financial safety net, like their social financial network around them, they probably can be a spendthrift for a very, very, very long time. And it can go either unnoticed, or it's been normalized, or there's always a backup plan. So they might never get to that stage. And a tightwad who comes from extreme poverty, or who is still in a social circle where spending money is really not the norm, even though they are probably secretly sitting on quite a stash, it doesn't get noted. So I feel like a lot of people only really start to experience stress around their finances once they really fall out of tune with whatever is around them and what whoever around them is doing. So if that's not the case, most people don't really notice that something is off or that something is different. If they are still performing according to what they perceive the norm to be, I don't think most people would clock that something is off, if you will. So I only expect to see this at the extremes, and once they really fall out of step with what they think is normal. Now, does that mean that, if you're a slight tightwad or a slight spendthrift, that you're never going to experience stress around money? Not everyone experiences stress around money, which I think one of the biggest stressors about money. And it really doesn't matter too much in this case if you are a spendthrift or a tightwad, if we're just looking in normal proportions. But it's this thing called keeping up with the Joneses, or sometimes also known as lifestyle inflation. And they kind of go hand in hand. So lifestyle inflation is what happens if you start making more money. So for example, you move through your career trajectory, you get promoted, or it's due to your experience or your seniority level, and then you keep moving up wage bands. We hope, at least. And as a result of that, you know like, okay, well, I started making 20K more per year, 30K more per year, 50K more per year. Let's just ignore inflation for now, because 20K now is not what it used to be, I'm afraid. And then they start changing their life. Oh, well, now that I make an additional 20K, we can't afford an additional holiday. Or now that I make an additional 50K, we should upgrade our cars, or we should upgrade our living arrangements. And we just keep upgrading and upgrading and upgrading against an ever-changing wage. And as a result, we don't actually change a lot of the proportions that we're working with. So, for example, if your wage was originally 100%, now it's 120. Let's just make it easy for that sake. Some people could go, and tightwads might be a bit more like this, where they're like, well, I now have the additional 20%, which means I can save that whole additional 20%. But what most people do is that they don't save the additional whole 20%. No, they just add an additional 20% to what they were already saving. But that is not the same thing. So they do move up their savings a bit, but they move up their spending so much more. And this is often known as lifestyle inflation, where you could be so much better off financially, but you choose to divert it not towards savings or investments, which I guess is most financial advice and financial guides out there. But most of it continues to go into conspicuous consumption. Oh, and in addition to savings and investments, obviously debt repayments would also be really quite helpful. If you're looking at the financial hierarchy. Tightwads, it would be a bit different. I think they would handle this a bit differently. But stresses that can come with being a tightwad is just that you do have money to improve your life, and you just kind of refuse to do it. Another thing which I've noticed a bit with tightwads, but this is more anecdotal than it is scientific, is that especially if this comes from, like I said, a scarcity mindset or a fear mindset, this is money that is being kept in the bank. This is not money that gets invested. This is not money that they want to make more money with, but it's just money that sits there as a number so they know that they have a buffer. But realistically, and again, this is not financial advice. I'm not allowed to give financial advice, and I have no intention of doing so. But if you've got inflation rates around 10% and your savings rate, like the interest you get on your savings account is 2%, you know that you're losing 8% a year. That's not financial advice. That's basic mathematics. So that is very unfortunate, because the idea and the psychology of a tightwad is to never lose money. But that doesn't work in the way that they think it works. And it is just, especially more for people who come from a severe scarcity mindset. I find it quite sad to think about, realistically, because I know exactly why they're doing what they're doing, but it's not working in the way that they think it's working. They're trying to protect their money, but they're losing out regardless. That's not for me to say like, oh, everyone should be investing. It's just these things don't align as well as the average person thinks they might.
That's actually a really interesting point. And what's coming to mind for me is, people have different relationships with risk, and that's probably according to our personalities too. But that what you just described with the savings account and the, inflation rate, how do you see, how do people make decisions based on their relationship with risk, and how can they optimize that?
Ooh, that is a very good one. There is a large body of literature on this. A lot of older behavioral science, or how behavioral science actually started as a field, was a lot of looking at people's risk attitude and how it influenced their economic decisions. So this field of study, or this specific topic, easily goes back like 60 to 80 years. So bear with me as I try to condense that.
Okay.
But I think on average, we find that most people are risk averse. So that would be the majority of people. People are not super keen on risk. So if they get presented with like, as a very simple example, like, hey, you can earn $400, but that's 80% risk, meaning that you've got 20% of not earning anything, or you can have $300 for certain. Now, obviously, in the first gamble, like the expected value is 320. It's 80% of 400. Most people still pick the 300. Most people don't pick the risk. They prefer to have a certain equivalent of a piece of money or an amount of money. If you flip this around and you ask people like, hey, would you prefer to lose $400 with an 80% chance, or 20% chance that you don't lose anything? Or would you like to lose, or would you prefer to lose? I don't think anyone likes to lose. Would you prefer to lose $300 for certain? Now people get risk seeking. So this kind of depends on the domain that you're in. So are we talking about gains, or are we talking about potential losses? And are the people that you're talking to perceiving this as a gain or as a loss? Because when it comes to investing, so if you move from saving to investing, a lot of people, they don't necessarily think about, I think the S&P has had an annual average return of about 8% or so. Most people don't look at the gain possibilities of that. They don't compare the 8% average the S&P against the 2% that you're getting on your savings account, and they don't then look at the difference, where one of them is, yes, a risk gain, but the other one is essentially a certain loss, because you have to take inflation into account, and inflation is always higher than the savings rate. That is something that you can be pretty sure of. But that's not how most people approach it. When most people think of investing, a lot of them think about how risky the market is, and realistically, they are thinking of the risk of losing all of the money. So they're thinking of super salient examples. So the 1929 crash, a very famous Wall Street crash historically, but also the much more recent crisis of 08, 09, which for a lot of people, especially if they're older, was still very salient. A lot of people lost a lot of money then, especially if they realized their losses, meaning that they cashed out because, well, it was worth nothing anymore anyway, which means you are now absolutely left with nothing. So if you can conjure up these very salient experiences, your entire frame, your entire focus is now on loss. So your attitude towards investing is that you're only thinking about loss. And that is not particularly attractive.
Definitely not. And you can see how everything comes back to mindset in so many ways, right? And the way that we can view the potential positives and still protect ourselves from a downside. And maybe there's a way for people to frame a certain level of security.
Sure.
And then above that, maybe where we are able to take risks.
I think that's, again, not personal financial advice, but I think if you look at something as simple as the financial hierarchy, which is a tool a lot of financial advisors use, essentially the couple of bottom rungs of that hierarchy, if that's how that works, is essentially just get your income to meet your expenses. From there on, if you have any debt, make sure that any income that is surplus to your expenses, which is already quite a luxury position to be in, can cover the debt additionally until you've annihilated the debt. Then set up an emergency buffer. Then save for whatever your shorter to longer term goals are, and then get into investing. Now, obviously, if you've got like a longer term goal, which is like 40 years down the line, probably investing is something that works out quite well for you in the meantime. But if you've got super urgent things, the hierarchy seems to suggest it makes sense that you save for those first. Again, people use the hierarchy differently, whether it's individuals applying it to themselves or financial advisors, of course, applying it to the actual context of the individual. So this is very much a guideline. This is not set in stone. But from that perspective, as you were saying, it makes sense to have a buffer first. So an emergency buffer or whatever, like think the average recommendation is 3 to 6 months of your expenses or of your actual wage set aside, and from then on, you investing might make sense for you.
Is there any behavioral science around, how people view themselves and their sense of self-worth, and then how they make financial decisions?
Absolutely. So I think I mentioned this a bit earlier, but this phenomenon is very often referred to as keeping up with the Joneses, which is just comes from social psychology, and it refers to upward and downward social comparison. So if you have a lovely house, a beautiful house, 5 bedrooms, beautiful garden, would be easily featured within Home Digest or whatever these magazines are called, you think objectively, in absolute terms, you'd be quite happy. However, if your house is the ugliest and the smallest in your entire neighborhood, despite the fact that it is objectively beautiful and desirable, you will probably be the unhappiest person in the street. And this is known as upward social comparison. So you're comparing to everything and everyone around you that is doing better. This is not necessarily exclusive to money and financial decision making. You can do this in terms of any kind of aspect. So you can do this in the number of friends that you have, or the strength of your social ties, or how close or not close you are with your family, how educated you are, how good you are at sports. It can honestly be anything. How skinny you are, how not skinny you are, you name it. Honestly, any skill, any attribute, any feature can be compared on, and people do this. Now, this comes from evolutionary psychology. There is evolutionary value to this because we are pack animals, and for your survival skills, or for your chance of survival, it's not good to be in the bottom of the pack. So this is why we do this. So no one wants to be in the bottom of the pack. But as I said, after a while, especially if you're benchmarking this on conspicuous consumption, there is no winning. Like, if you objectively are in a financially great position, having beautiful things and having plenty of money left and doing great in the stock market and having a great career up ahead, in front of you, but then still not feeling happy because it seems that everyone around you is doing better, which is, first of all, that's a facade to begin with. You don't know how other people are doing. I think especially very conspicuous consumer countries have a lot of issues with this, where lives look beautiful, but you have no idea how much debt someone is in to actually finance this, if they are happy, what they've had to sacrifice to get to these stages, and whether the happiness that you think you would feel in that situation is actually what they are experiencing. Because we don't know people's internal dialogue. We only know our own. We only know our own full picture, and we're essentially comparing that to the Instagram reel of someone else. It's a very unfair comparison. We're never going to end up on top in that regard. So what happens, especially if you compare yourself upwards a lot, so you compare yourself to people who you perceive to be better off, is you will try to emulate, because you think that will make you feel better. You think that is what you should be aspiring towards. This is why social media is also so incredibly dangerous, because we think that these people are like us, especially influencers profit a lot of this, where originally they are like us, or we perceive them to be like us, but they live lifestyles which are increasingly difficult to emulate, which is obviously how they can market a lot of things to us, because aspirational marketing is a gold mine. But from a financial decision perspective, what's happening is that we try to purchase whatever it is that we associate with this lifestyle. And in the case of the, keeping up with the Joneses example, that might mean, again, upgrading your house, your cars, your wardrobe, doing things that you think will get you to that lifestyle, to that level of status. And that can bankrupt people. And knowing the levels of consumer debt in very conspicuous consumption-driven countries, this is bankrupting people. This is very, very problematic. This is a very problematic behavior. I understand fully why it occurs, but it is not healthy and it is not helpful. Now, what you can also do is, obviously, if there's upward social comparison, there is downward social comparison, meaning that you compare yourself to people who are worse off than you, but people tend to only really do this as a coping mechanism. So it's almost, I don't want to call it schadenfreude, so like laughing or gloating over other people's suffering, because that's, not great. But you can, as a person, make yourself feel better. The healthier version of this is if you compare yourself to who you were a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, because you are then, you could potentially then be comparing yourself to what was a lesser version of yourself, or just a more inexperienced version of yourself, someone who only just started their financial improvement journey. And then you can look at the progress that you yourself have already made. That would be a very healthy way of doing downward social comparison, because it would be against an old, like a past version of yourself. That's a very healthy, very motivational way of doing it.
Oh, I love that. That's a great grab right there, because that's truthfully that's it relates so well back to our mindset and how we develop a healthy mindset, and the whole concept of being better, right? I always say, like, I just want to be better than I was yesterday, and keep looking for those small, consistent habits that help people get there. And I think those relate so heavily in the finance world and the personal finance world, because we're all making choices every day that put us in the positions that we're in. Yes, there are things that affect us that we didn't see coming, or might just happen, that we didn't have control of. But in the personal finance world, there really are so many choices we can make to empower ourselves and help us, be a little bit better, and then help the next generation be a little bit better. And that's really, everything that I love in these stories that we're collecting here. So I love the way that you're taking your behavioral science PhD and bringing that academic background into the really practical world of how people can better their lives. And this is it's a really cool conversation, because in America, we are constantly facing down, more marketing, more stuff, more comparison, and it's really affecting the mental health of, so many generations of Americans. So there's just a lot of practical application to this, to everything that you're studying and bringing into the world. So thank you. There's a question that I ask everybody that comes on my podcast, because I'm really after that sense of generational learning and why we go through the things we go through and what we learn from them. But that question is, what's a piece of advice that you would give to your younger self?
So another reason I ended up studying economic psychology, because I used to be incredibly bad at managing money, because I am a massive spendthrift. Not like I'm not hypomanic, but like I'm out there. And I think a piece of advice I would give myself in hindsight is find out why you have a constant need to buy things. Find out what it is that you're trying to get to, because it has nothing to do with wanting to own 50 pairs of shoes, which I generally did at one stage in my life. I had a side job just to buy shoes, which is in hindsight very problematic. It's just like, what is it that you're trying to do? And in my case, I think particularly it's like, I mean, I love fashion, I really do. But in the grand scheme of things, I just wanted to look nice, because I was convinced like the nicer I looked, the more people would actually like me. I would stand out more. It would be easier for me to get noticed and to get along with people. And that's, I mean, in hindsight, very sad. At the time I was 18, so like I'll cut myself some slack. But it's, it's obviously not how that works. Like there's no number of pairs of shoes that's gonna get you more liked. That's more about being a kind and a decent person, and just I don't know, a net benefit to being someone's life. Simple as.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And yeah, I love that advice, and I love, the more that we learn to love ourselves, the better we relate to other people, I think. So yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I just want to thank you for coming on What I Meant to Say today. And I want people to be able to know where they can connect with you and find all of the things that you're putting out in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what people want to connect for. So if you want to connect in a more professional way, obviously, come to my LinkedIn. You'll get the plethora of blog posts I post every week, so you'll get a whole bunch of notifications. If you want to follow along more casually, please, just go to Twitter or X or whatever the network is called these days. If it's still around when this episode comes live, might be a bit of a risk these days. And obviously, if you're interested more in the behavioral science of things and how you can apply it to behavioral science, or If you're more interested in the behavioral science side of things and how you can apply that to your life and how it can help you manage your finances, I've got a blog called Money on the Mind. Please come see me there.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And I'm your host, Wendy Jones, on What I Meant to Say. I'm here with Merle Akker, and we're here to remind you to just be you, be real, and be better.
Thank you for joining us on What I Meant to Say, another production of Inspired Edutainment brought to you by Be Better Media.